And welcome once again to Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr, joined by Juan Zarate, our national security analyst. Juan, good to see you.
Bob, great to see you.
So the president makes a very important speech, kind of laying out what he sees as the future approach to what's been called the war on terror. What was he trying to do?
Well, in the first instance, Bob, he was trying to deal with a lot of criticism that he was getting in pieces and parts with respect to the use of targeted strikes, the long-term detention problems with Guantanamo, questions about surveillance. So he was in part trying to deal with the cascading effect of criticism on counterterrorism policies. But more importantly, I think he was trying to take a step back to assess the threat the way that it has changed. We've talked about that often here on Flashpoints. The Al-Qaeda of 2013 is not the same Al-Qaeda of 2001. And really trying to lay out a vision for not only the constraint of the use of power, things like targeted strikes, but forecasting the end of the war on terror. I mean, remember, this is a president that has talked about the tides of war receding, taking great pride in ending the war in Iraq, talking about 2014, the end of combat troops in Afghanistan. And so I think the president was really trying to lay a marker down to say, not only can we imagine the end of the war on terror, but we have to define it, we have to move toward it. And part of movement toward that end of the war on terror is constraining our power and shifting our policies and dealing with a more fractured, still dangerous, but containable threat, and doing it proportionally and in a way that constrains the use of power. Very interesting speech, Bob.
How do you think the enemies view that speech? Because in one sense, you have the president here saying, you know, the war on terror has to stop at some point. Yeah. The threat is receding, although maybe it's fractured somewhat. This could be construed maybe as emboldening some of these people.
Maybe. I think what it does, though, it also, unfortunately, is a one-sided argument. It's clearly, you don't want to be defined by the enemy. You don't want the enemy to sort of define your culture, your practices, etc. But the other side in a war has a vote. And so we could say all we want that the tides of war are receding, but it's very hard to define that space when the enemy itself continues to attack, when Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula continues to plot against U.S. Interests and continues to be a force in Yemen and Saudi Arabia, when Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb continues to fight in Mali and other places, where Al-Shabaab is not yet extinguished in Somalia. And so to say that, you know, the threat has shifted and is different is fine, but to say that the war on terror is winding down because we say so doesn't necessarily reflect the reality that the threat itself may change, and there may be threats to the U.S. in ways that we can't imagine today, but may emerge tomorrow.
From what the president said, what do you take will be his strategy position in attacking this on a fragmented basis? I mean, you don't have the enemy all collected in one place. This isn't like we can go invade somewhere and take on Al-Qaeda.
Right. I think you've already seen the way the counterterrorism policy and operations have shifted. You've seen the use of targeted strikes where necessary, where we've identified cells and pockets of Al-Qaeda or related groups that are trying to target the U.S. So we've seen that already. The declassified, for example, was the fact that we killed Anwar al-Awlaki. The U.S. government killed an American citizen, the Yemeni American, because he was an operational planner for Al-Qaeda. So we're going to continue to do that. You're also going to continue to see a regional-based approach. We've seen it in East Africa. In the Bush administration, you saw it heavily in Southeast Asia. You're seeing it in North Africa and the Maghreb, where the U.S. is a supporter. We provide intelligence, maybe some logistical support, but the regional players or the major actors that have an interest, like France and Mali, like the Ugandans, like the Kenyans, the Ethiopians in Somalia, we're going to be supportive. They're the ones who are going to do the bulk of the fighting. So you've already started to see the way the counterterrorism policy has shifted, in part because that's where the enemy is and that's how we can operate.
How much of this is about controlling the narrative, trying to change the tone, and how much of is it a change in operations?
I think it's both, potentially. I think the president is trying to say, look, we need to talk about this differently. We don't need to aggrandize the enemy. He said, you know, not every group of thugs that call themselves Al-Qaeda are the same kind of threat. And so in some ways, he's trying to sort of recalibrate the way we think about risk and resilience. And I think you see this in the speech. I think the way that the U.S. actually reacted to the Boston Marathon bombings affected the president and his ability to give this speech, or at least as aggressively as he did. He saw that Boston was resilient, that the American public didn't overreact to the problem, understood that this wasn't on the scale of 9/11. And so this is a speech about calibration and proportionality and how we deal with the threat, and a shift in the tone, and to say, look, we can constrain our power because the threat is diminished. and we don't have to overreact to every threat that emerges. I like to say, look, we don't have to scurry around and the president doesn't have to scramble just every time Al-Qaeda says boo, right? And so the president, I think, is trying to embed that narrative. Operationally, there's attempts to constrain power. I think that's where you're going to see a lot of difficulty, because the counterterrorism community is going to find it very hard to decide not to try to dismantle cells and operations that are plotting something, but where we may not have evidence that they're plotting to attack New York, Boston, Washington, but they're still there. They're Al-Qaeda, they're plotting, planning. Does that mean we can't strike them? That's a tough question.
And that'll be a topic for another time. Juan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Bob.
And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr.